So it's worthwhile to go off and delve into how exactly I think they're going to do that. So step one, well, here's all the different techniques that are outlined in this explanatory memorandum. This is the way that Frank Gaffney organized it. Number one, which we're attempting to rectify today, is they want to keep us ignorant of all their different techniques, right? So let's talk about what is Sharia specifically, because this is the heart of the different value systems that we have. You know, we have a different set of values, and the best way of going off and highlighting the differences in these values is to examine what is in Sharia. Number one, and you know, whenever you hear discussions of Sharia, you only hear things like, well, it's just differences in approaches to marriage licensing and stuff like that. You're going to get the generic stuff that's not too inflammatory, right? But what you won't hear are things like, you know, that there's a hadith passage that talks about accursed is the one around homosexuality, for example. Now, I'm not a proponent, I don't support homosexuality, but a Christian approach to this is more like 1 Corinthians 6:9 that says, hey, those who practice and won't inherit the kingdom of God. It's a message of love saying, you know, I don't support it, but and it's because it's not good for you. For them, it's a much different approach. If you are caught practicing as Lot did, this is the case of, which is homosexuality. It says that the people were burned and that they had a wall thrown down on them. If you go over and look at what's going on in Iran in this context, they're pushing them off buildings. It's a slightly different approach to values, right? And when the Quran in Surah chapter 5 talks about those who wage war against God and His messenger should be punished by death, crucifixion, the amputation of an alternate hand or foot, or banishment. They have a slightly different approach to freedom of religion, if you will, than we do, right? They've also got a slightly different approach to what happens what's acceptable in a marriage bond. For example, in here, the man's allowed to go off and hit the woman in Sharia law. Under Christian law, Judeo-Christian framework, that's a no-no. And so there are different value systems between Sharia and our Judeo-Christian foundation. One of the areas that I think we finally got as a society the ability to wrap our minds around it most recently was around female genital mutilation. That's a practice that's acceptable under Sharia law. We don't find it very acceptable. And I'm happy to say, I think with unanimous support across the board, all of our legislators, including me, I sponsored one of the bills and introduced one of the bills to ban female genital mutilation in the state. People realized that there was a difference in what was accepted in one culture versus ours. So that was a good wake-up call. Another area that you'll find that's a little bit different as well is there's a common ingredient in a lot of Sharia law. They treat women as property. And so that ties into human trafficking as well. And that's very prevalent. So this is the road that they want to take us down, and they don't want us talking about these particular ties to Sharia law. But it's up to us to go off and learn about this. There's another good book on this, by the way, too. Glenn Beck did a very good book called It Is About Islam, and he's got all the specific Quran and Hadith references that talk about this in that book. So here's another technique that we can see prevalent here in the state of Michigan already, unfortunately. It's the whole idea of banning certain types of speech. Speech codes. Now we've seen it mostly here in the United States promoted as part of this Red-Green Alliance on talking about specific gender pronouns and stuff in schools. And if you don't call them by the right name or right gender or whatever, you're going to be singled out and penalized. And maybe you lose your job. If you go up to Canada, this stuff is already in place right now. And this is also one of the reasons I've been such a proponent of campus free speech bills. You know, our First Amendment's very special. It talks about the freedom of speech. We don't need that First Amendment freedom of speech to protect us from people saying, I love you, right? You need that First Amendment freedom of speech to protect the right of somebody to go off and say something that somebody may take objection to. That's not what they're trying to get at. They're trying to restrict this and start limiting it so that nobody can go off and highlight what's really going on in Islam or in some other areas. They want to actually shut you down because they'll call you immediately. Right now, if they came in, they'd be screaming Islamophobe to me right now. And what did we experience? Dick Manasiri here, by the way, with Secure Michigan, he deserves a special shout out. He was with me. I introduced a resolution that essentially put a pause button on the Syrian refugees coming to the state. I want to encourage Governor Snyder to continue his policy of pushing the pause button, because I actually got briefed on the screening policy that was used to actually get refugees into our state. And essentially the United Nations was who specified who came in here. And the interviews that were being conducted were over the phone through a translator. They never even talked to the person that was there. They had no data to back up whether or not somebody was saying something that was true or not. It was just really bad policy. So we, of course, had a session. We had a hearing in government operations. It was chaired by the senator from this district. And we had during that hearing, within 24 hours of notice of that, they had over 60 people from CARE and other like organizations out there to protest the resolution that I said, which was merely saying the same thing that President Trump did essentially when he took office, is let's put the pause button on this until we can evaluate what the security risks associated with this policy are. And we got called racist. It was published in the paper and spread all around. Last time I checked, Syria is not a race. But it's not going to keep them from trying to shut you down and keep you silent. This is all about silencing free speech. And if we can't go off and talk about the risks that we have here, then it's one more way that they can make us defenseless. So let's go into something else. How about demanding concessions? Now we've seen all these three so far, we've seen actual instances of this here in Michigan. That FGM that was performed, that procedure was actually in my district. It was about a mile away from where I grew up. So this blasphemy and slander, these speech codes, that's happening right here in Michigan now. Usually pushing it under anti-bullying guise, but ultimately once they start enumerating the words that you cannot use, it's a matter of time before they add in all these other ones that Bridget Gabriel would be immediately thrown into prison for on a regular basis. So